to everybody, and welcome to our presentation today. Like Nancy said, I'm going to talk about the GFTA with you today. Before we do that, there are a few things that we need to move on to first. So, like we said, I have some disclosures. First off, I am an employee of Pearson Clinical Assessment, and Pearson Clinical Assessment is the publisher for GFTA-3. In my presentation today, I am going to focus on the administration, scoring, and interpretation for GFTA-3, and will not be talking about any other articulation. So, as we're getting our act together here, we're proceeding to the next slide, and the next slide is about learner outcomes. So, at the end of our presentation today, you will be able to describe the administration and scoring for GFTA-3, as well as describe and apply GFTA-3's definitions for emergence of speech sounds, as well as mastery of speech sounds. Also, you will be able to interpret the data from case studies to propose an intervention plan. Our agenda to cover is that we will be talking about GFTA-3 new features, as well as administration and scoring changes that have occurred from GFTA-2 to 3. We'll also answer some questions that we've been getting from clinicians, such as why are GFTA-3 scores different from GFTA-2, as well as what is meant by emergence versus mastery of speech sounds. Again, we'll talk about the interpretation of results from children's typical and atypical speech patterns. We have a couple of case studies to share with you, and then from those we'll talk about intervention planning based upon children's typical and atypical speech patterns. At the very end, we'll take some questions and answers. So new features that we're going to talk about GFTA-3 is that there is a new digital administration scoring. There are options there for us, and we'll get to that later on. We'll also talk about the current normative data that's presented, or rather that's a new feature of GFTA-3. Consonants are assessed in multiple contexts. We'll get into that later in more detail. But again, that's a new feature, as well as we have updated analyses, such as we have a new R analysis that enables you to look at production separately for the ER, as well as the vowel plus the R and R blend, such as in tree, for instance. We also have a new vowel error analysis. It's useful as an indicator of apraxia, as our clinicians have told us about. It is not going to figure into your raw score, but however, it is a qualitative analysis that we have been told, and we are proud of that it's useful for clinical practice. Also, Also, we have an updated sounds and sentences test. It's now a sentence annotation format and then we also have an optional intelligibility rating to go along with that. The art we're going to get to shortly, but instead of having one set of art stimuli, we now have two, one for ages 2 to 6-11 and one for ages 7 and up. So talking about administration and scoring, we have some good news. And the good news is, if you're used to administering GFTA-2, there's not much new to learn about the administration. And that is that what's the same then in sounds and words? Well, what you do is you show the examinee the picture prompt, and you ask, what is this? And they should be able to give you the name of, or the label for that picture. If they are not, a standard cue is provided, including asking that examinee to repeat the word if they give you a blank stare and there's no response. So you can just say, repeat this, and then you ask them to do that. For sounds and sentences, what's the same in administration is that, again, you're going to present the picture stimuli as you tell that person a story. For sounds and words administration, we're going to talk about the differences now. And what's different is, as we said before, one of the new features is, instead of having one set of picture stimuli, we now have two. There's one set for ages 2 to 6-11, and there's another set for 7 and older. What we would like to say is that you can use either set because the target words and target sounds are exactly the same. These are just suggested age ranges. However, if you find that the child you're testing is 7 but enjoys cartoon-like pictures, go ahead and use that first set. Um, that's that's been suggested for the younger kids. And then if you're testing somebody who's 8 who enjoys, or I'm sorry, if you're testing a precocious 5-year-old who enjoys looking at more realistic pictures, go ahead and use the other set. Again, um, they test the exact same target sounds and the exact same target words, so either set will be appropriate as you see fit using your clinical judgment. That is not going to be true for sounds and sentences. We have 2 brand new stories, one that has more repetition in it that's geared toward the younger set. Also, the storyline is more child-based. The other one is more what we would say older school-based or teenage-based, and that's how we collected the data. So if you want to use the norm reference scores, you are going to have to give the story that goes along with it, and that is for the first story, what animal do you think it is? That is for 4 to 6'11". If you want norm-based scores for the older child that you're testing, you will want to use that second story that's geared for 7 to 21'11". So distribution of consonants in GFTA-3. We've had some questions about these when we started looking at the target words that we wanted to develop for GFTA-3. We did look at the frequency of occurrence, but what we really looked at was we examined each speech sound in target words to ensure that the sound had good psychometric properties. In other words, we're saying, does this sound, what's the performance of this? Is it going to distinguish somebody who has an articulation disorder versus somebody who does not? We also tried out and selected words that were familiar for a wide range. Again, we start this test at 2 and go all the way to 21'11". So we wanted to make sure that the words were familiar enough for the younger set, but not so much that it would offend the older set as well. We tried out so many words, and what we would also do is consider deleting words with too many dialectal variations. We'll talk about dialectal variations later in more detail, but for right now what we want to say is dialectal variations in GFTA-3 do not count as errors. And so for words that had too many regional differences, it was going to be difficult for an examiner to score. An example that we have on there is the word sandwich. When we tried that out in tryout, we had responses that were considered correct, such as sandwich, 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 so too many. And because of usability, for user friendliness, we decided to take out words that had that many regional differences. We talked about the range of complexity in syllable shapes, and what we really wanted was to make sure that, again, to cover the range of 2 to 21'11", and looking at the developmental progression, we knew that there were words that needed to have a CD or a consonant vowel pattern, but also we needed to have words that were much more complex, that would have multisyllabic constructions as well. We looked for targeted multiple occurrences. We tried to get at least 2 to 3 of each consonant in each word position, but there were some exceptions, and that had to do with the frequency of how often they occurred in the English language. So, for example, some of the consonants only have one exemplar in either initial, medial, or final position, such as the voiceless TH. It just doesn't come up that often in English. Also, some consonants will have more than 3 exemplars in word position. Some examples we could come up with are in final N and L and R. I was kind of telling a colleague, why does this happen? And it's kind of reminiscent of, if you know Scrabble, you're going to get a lot more tiles that have an N or an L versus an R, versus you're only going to get one Z or one Q. And that, again, while we don't base the consonant distribution exactly on our occurrence in English, it does pattern that quite much. quite often. And then R includes consonantal as well as vocalic R. So the words, using those goals in mind, this is the word set that was chosen. They minimized the administration time. We didn't want to choose too few words because we, again, wanted to include as many opportunities for consonant productions as possible, but yet we wanted to stick to a short administration time that was important to clinicians in GFTA-2. It is still important to clinicians in GFTA-3. We wanted to also meet as many of the criteria as possible that we just discussed, while also maintaining the excellent psychometric properties of the item set. And when we talk about psychometric properties, we're talking about that we wanted to make sure each consonant that's produced is consistent with the developmental progression that we would expect to see from all the research that has been done across the years. We wanted to have high internal consistency of all the sounds that we targeted across GFTA-3, as well as the clinical utility that we talked about before, which was that we wanted to make sure that these sounds are going to be produced correctly by typically developing children, and that children who are having difficulties with sound production definitely were not going to produce these sounds correctly. Or actually not all the time, is what we should really say. This next slide is going to show that GFTA-3 was published in September of last year, and from that time, we really respond or try to respond to clinical feedback and clinicians' feedback. And one of the things was that at first it was we'd like more space to write. So that was what we honored in the first printing, but after that first printing, we did revise the design, and the reason was because we had clinicians that told us that they would really prefer to go back to a design that was similar to GFTA-2, and that they may have less space to write the response, but that they could see at a glance the color coding for initial, medial, and final errors that were produced. This is an example of scoring differences. So there are quite a few scoring differences. Some of the ones that are the same is one consonant error is going to get 1 point, and if it's not an error, it gets 0 points. However, what's different is that every occurrence counts. So in GFTA-2, you had selected sounds and selected words. This time, every time a consonant or a consonant cluster is produced, it is an opportunity to be scored a 1 or a 0. Also, dialectal sensitive scoring. So what we're saying here is as our population has evolved, grown and evolved, a lot of individuals speak a dialectal variation. It's a difference. It's not a disorder, and so we don't want to count it as an error. So if you as a clinician are absolutely sure that the person you're testing is speaking a dialect of standard American English, don't count those productions as incorrect. Okay. Some other scoring things that we wanted to mark or note was that please go ahead and use a diacritical mark for a distortion or a variation, such as the lateral release, as you can see in this example here, and count that as an error. There are times, however, that you do want to use a diacritical mark as a notation, but it may not be considered an error, such as, we've been asked this, well, what if the sound is produced correctly, is acoustically accurate, but the way they produce it, it's a little off, their articulators are a little bit misplaced? Okay. So it's a little misplaced, but the sound is acoustically accurate, and that's what we want to judge on, and for that reason, that would not be counted as an error. Scoring no response, you would go ahead and write an NR if the child just did not respond at all, for whatever reason. For sometimes it's a younger child, and they see the word or they hear the word vegetable, and they're like, not going there, especially when that child is only 2 or 3. And so you would write that NR because every single consonant production counts. You would then want to write a dash, which symbolizes it was not produced, it was omitted, and put that across, as you can see in the example. In the case of vegetable, you're going to mark out the V, you're going to mark out the J, the T, the B, and the L as well. Recording final L's and R's is a little different in the example that we've shown. So sometimes that R is going to be dropped off completely, and they're going to say do. In that case, what we did was we transcribed to a D and an O, and we marked that R off as a substitution with an O. In other times, and the same with the apple. So instead of saying apple, they said apple. So what we did is we crossed out that L and we changed it to an O substitution. Okay, go to the next slide, please. Okay, and then we have self-correction. So sometimes the kids, especially if they've been in speech therapy for a while, they will say it incorrectly the first time, but they realize they said it incorrectly and they're going to self-correct. Sometimes they'll say hout, and then all of a sudden they go, oh, wait, it's house. So you're going to go ahead and write an SC, circle it, so that you are reminded, don't score that as a 1. It really should be scored as a 0 at that point. I have a question right now. It's from Marianne, and her question is, does an NR count as that many errors? Yes, when you have an NR, that means that that child did not say the word at all, so however many consonants are in that, or consonant clusters are in that word, that is how many errors there should be. Let's just take a look at an example. I know it's not an example on this slide, but let's go to the previous slide, and
as soon as I figure that out.
And look at an example of the word brother. So the child didn't produce brother. BR is 1 error because that is 1 consonant cluster. You're going to count that voice TH. That's another one. And then the is, that final is also counted as an omission or incorrect production. And so in that one, you would have a total of 3 errors in that word. Okay. Going forward, let's talk about consonant clusters, since we're just kind of talking about that with brother. And that is that just like GFTA-2, consonant clusters is 1 sound unit, and so it's counted as one error, whether both phonemes are substituted. So if a child said slide and they went twide, both the S and the L are substituted with a T and a W, it's still 1 error because it's still 1 sound production. Okay, next slide, please. Again, this one, but if they said one sound right and substituted 1, so instead of saying slide, they said swide and substituted that L with a W, again, it's considered, a consonant cluster is considered 1 sound production, so it's only 1 error. Now there is a difference in GFTA. It's not a GFTA-3 difference from GFTA-2. It's just something that we need to be more mindful of. Because every single consonant sound production is counted, there are instances when consonants may be adjacent to each other. Now, they're adjacent doesn't mean that they're consonant clusters because it's defined by a syllable boundary. In this case, the word monkey, the N and the K are not considered a cluster because they're separated by a syllable boundary. In that case, the NG, the engma, is counted as 1 production, and the K is counted as 1 production. Next slide, please. So we talked about scoring final R a little bit. Children produce final R or produce it inaccurately in different circumstances. In the first example, we have deer, and a child might go deal. So in that case, they retain that vowel and they just change that final R to an O. What you're going to do is transcribe that, mark that R as a substitute, or mark that R as an error that was substituted by the O. Sometimes, however, the child doesn't say deal, they just go do. And what they do is they took off the vowel and changed that R again to an O. It's still counted as one error. So regardless of which production the child does, it's one error in that the R was substituted with an O. But you do probably want to do that transcription so that you can see what the error really was. Was it a deal, or was it that they dropped that vowel and went do? Okay, next slide, please. Okay. There are instances where we're going to record. That's why we have that blank space there for transcription, but no error is counted. That occurs when there's a dialect appropriate response. As our society diversifies, there's more chance for that, and so in GFTA-3, in the appendices, you will find appendices that kind of guide about English-influenced Spanish, African American, and Southern English, as well as English influenced by an Asian language. There's examples for productions that should be counted as correct and rather than incorrect. In addition to that, there are times where you don't count an error, where the production is different from the target, and that would be like in an addition. So the child said swings instead of swing. It's an addition of that Z, however, we were really targeting the SW and the NG. Both were correct, so you might want to transcribe what the child said, but no errors are counted. Vowel substitutions. Vowels, as we said, are very important. We recognize that. That's why we have a qualitative analysis. However, true to GFTA-2, we are really just counting the consonants and consonant cluster production. Sounds and sentences administration has changed quite a bit. So not only do we have new stories, but the other thing that is new is now it's the structured task. So rather than a sentence repetition, rather than a story retell, it has now become a sentence repetition task. We thought about this long and hard, and the reason we changed was because we had input that said, it is especially difficult for children at the younger ages to listen to a story and then come back and have to retell that story. We spent a lot of time reprompting for this word and this word and this word and getting them through. So when we talked to the authors about it, we said, what is really the goal? And the goal is really for connected speech. And so we came to the idea that sentence repetition is still tapping into connected speech. So that's what we went with this time. During our different development processes and collecting of data, we found out that children 4 years old and older were the ones that were very successful at these tasks. Children that were 2 and 3, oftentimes they just could not handle these tasks, and we were not getting good data at that time, good consistent data with those children. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we talked about from last September when this first published, we've had a first printing and a revised printing. Again, this has to do with not that anything in administration, not that anything in scoring changed. It was that we wanted to honor what our clinicians said about what made it easier for them to see the results of their scores. And so we went to something where they could see the errors on the same page as the items themselves. Okay, so it does look a little bit differently when we say there's no change in scores. That's absolutely correct. However, there is a difference in how that calculation looks. So the top example comes from the first design, the original design, and because it's on multiple pages, what you're going to see is that you're going to have to look at the different raw scores and add them up for a total raw score. It looks a little bit differently on that revised design. You still have to do some adding, but as you can tell, they're more lined up and they're all on the same page rather than on a separate page. Okay. Something that is different this time around in sounds and sentences with the scoring is that not only is it that it's a different task altogether, but we have a different or an added bonus of having an intelligibility rating scoring. And so what that means is that after the child says each sentence, repeats each sentence, using your clinical judgment, you're going to give that child an intelligibility rating of, yeah, that was good. I understood all of the words that the child said, to, oh, yeah, that was pretty fair. I understood, maybe 50% or more, 50 to 80% of the time, or that was poor. I had to guess at what the child was saying in that sentence in total, or again, sometimes children just don't want to repeat that sentence at all, in which case I gave it no response. Okay? Okay. So what we do with that intelligibility score is, again, we're going to rate each sentence as the child produces that sentence. And then I'm going to, at the end, total it up. In this case, the example is that child was pretty good. He had 8 sentences that I judged to be good, and 12 sentences were fair, but no poor, and he was a trooper. He imitated every single sentence. So what do I do with those scores? Next slide, and I'll show you. 27. And so what I do with that, yeah, 27. There you go.
No, it didn't go. Going the wrong direction.
The suspense is killing me. So, yeah, and then you're going to hit spin. Next. Yeah. There we go. And so what do we do with that? And so what we do with that is, again, I added up all the ones that were good ratings. So there were 18 good ratings, and then there were 20 productions in all. So I take that 18 divided by 20, and I get a percentage. And the percentage is that 90% overall intelligibility rating. I then go to, in the manual, there's Appendix C, Table C1, and it gives the percentage by ages of, for a child's age, how many overall good ratings there should be. And I plug those numbers in. For this child, 17.5% of the sample had less than 90%, and then 82.5% of that sample of that age were able to have 90% or better ratings of good ratings. And so this kid is fine. This child is okay in terms of intelligibility because he's at 90%. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the very beginning, when we talked about new features, one of the features we talked about is that this time around, GFTA-3 is going to have some digital offerings. We have the first digital offering being Q Interactive. In Q Interactive, 2 iPads are used that are connected via Bluetooth. One iPad is going to serve as the record form per se, where you have test administration directions that are shown. You have control of the visual stimuli, where you're going to be able to scroll. You have the control to scroll from one stimulus to the other, as well as an area to record your responses. The second iPad is the one that faces your examinee, and that iPad is used to view and respond to this. In other words, it's going to be your easel, or what we call the STEM book. What's exciting is we have real-time scoring. Okay. So there is also, in addition to Q Interactive, what we'll see is when we talked about what the examiners, we talked about you have control for recording and on-time scoring. This is what an example of that scoring screen. So you present the picture, the child labels that picture, and what's going to happen is if they get it right, everything's good. Don't touch any of the keys. But if they get it wrong, what you're going to do, so the example is plate. If the child said late and then produce that P, you touch that P, your keypad lights up, and you're going to hit the key to represent what the child said or didn't say. If the child said late instead of plate, you're going to hit P, and then you can see that there's a dash, and you're going to hit it to show that it's an omission. And then at the end of administration, like we said, it's real-time scoring. You would have all the errors already calculated for you. Okay, next slide, please. So we also talked about different digital options. That Q Interactive was one. Another option that we have is Q Global. In this case, rather than using 2 iPads, you use one, and then to present the digital stimulus, and then you would record your responses on a printed or paper record form. The other one that you could do is that rather than using an iPad, you could also use a tablet, such as a laptop, for instance. Again, that serves as your digital easel or digital stim book, and you record your responses on a paper record form. Okay, error analysis. This is new and it's exciting to us. We hope it's exciting to the clinicians. And that is that we have a phonetic error analysis. In the first printing, we show an example of what it looks like. It's on multiple pages. It works exactly the same way as on the second printing, the revised printing of it. The difference is that it is closer to the item set so that there is less flipping back and forth of those pages. Okay, we also included, this is new, these two are new, the R error analysis and the vowel error analysis. Again, you'll see how they look in the first printing versus the revised printing. The analysis are exactly the same. The labeling looks a little bit different, and that has to do with, again, the space, because we wanted in that revised printing to bring it closer to the items themselves and having less of a flipping of the pages. We're going to talk about these, not just that they're designed, but why they're there. The reason that we included the R error analysis was we heard from a lot of clinicians that said, what do I do? The R's are different. There's a difference between an ER production error versus a vocalic R production difference, versus what if it's because they're consonant clusters and they can't get that R? They're all different. We totally agree with that, and so that's why we came up with the R analysis, so that you could see what is going on with the R. For the vowel error analysis, we thought it was important not simply, but because we heard that there is a lot more diagnosis of children with apraxia. And one of the hallmarks of apraxia is that there is difficulty not only in producing vowels, but a consistency in producing vowels correctly. So we included that error analysis, the vowel error analysis, so that there's more direction as could this possibly be childhood apraxia we're dealing with. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, the error analysis, this is the sounds and sentences error analysis for the consonants. It works exactly the same way. If you have an error, a consonant error that you've recorded, you can go ahead, find that number, that item number in the error table and slash through it to indicate that it was an error. Oftentimes what you're going to see after you've done this analysis is you'll be able to see if there's multiple slashes across that row, or if there's only one. If there's one, then you would think, oh, okay, maybe they've not mastered it, they're on their way, versus every single time all the numbers are slashed for, let's say, the production of S, and that would give you a heads up this child has not even begun to produce S, and that emergence hasn't even occurred. Okay. This is our map test results. What we're doing is we're going to map the test results on emergence and mastery. It's what I alluded to before. When you look at those error analyses, that constant error analyses, you can transfer it here and you can say, hey, when are S's supposed to come in for a child who's 6 and is a female, versus when are S's supposed to be mastered for a child who's a female at 6? There is a difference of that. I want to see if it's coming in at all in comparison to her peers, versus when she has to get them all right in comparison to her peers. And these tables are found on record form page 8. It's the last page of that revised design of that record form, as well as you can find it in Appendix D in the manual. So we were talking about, it's been out, GFTA-3 has been out for a while, and we have gotten some clinicians' questions. One of them happens to be, why are the scores so different for GFTA-3 and GFTA-2? Well, the scores may be different because the U.S. population is different. GFTA-2 norms were collected way back in 1999. We're not saying that motor skills have changed in children, in specific children. What we are saying is that the populations have changed. They've become more diverse. And so there are more differences in how consonants are produced. That, again, is why we do have dialectal variations as considerations. And if you know that the child or the individual that you are testing speaks a dialectal variation of Standard American English, don't count those as errors. The test item set is different. We try to retain about a third of the words, but again, that means 2/3 of the words are different. Many of those words have a more complex word shape to them as well. Scoring is different. So instead of having one targeted sound and one targeted word, each consonant error is counted. The resulting raw scores and norms are different. Although the means for each sound match in GFTA-2, that GFTA-2 and GFTA-3 are very similar, the raw scores are different. And again, because the raw scores, there's many more raw scores to count in this. But there's another difference, and we'll talk about that in our next slides. And they have to do with emergence versus mastery, as well as the premise between GFTA-2 and 3. Okay. So what are the premise? In GFTA-2, the premise was if a phoneme is counted correctly, or counted correct as a correct production, the child has mastered the production of that phoneme. In GFTA-3, the premise is a little different in that phonemes should be tested in multiple contexts. Again, as we've said, it's affected by surrounding vowels and consonants, the complexity of the word structure. In addition, research has shown us that children begin to correctly produce phonemes at different ages, with a time period between emergence and mastery of sounds. So what we're saying is a child doesn't usually not say R and then wake up one day and say, oh, I'm going to say R today, and say every single R correctly. Rather, our data show that children as young as 2.5, start playing around with R and can get some R productions right. And that as they practice more and more, by the time they reach 7, 11, 8 years old, then they're going to master R. The other thing that we talk about is that low standard scores indicate that a child's speech sound is not comparable or comparable to age gender pairs. Okay? So we've had this question a lot. It seems like there are a lot of R productions. And if my child gets R wrong, that's why they get such a low score. Well, yes, but it's not just that. It's not due to the number of occurrences of R's on that test, because the number of R occurrences contribute to the total raw score, and the normative score accounts for all the number of errors that very young children make. So we know that a very young child, let's say 2.5, if they get all their R's wrong, that's expected, and that's accounted for in their standard score, versus a child who is 7 and gets every single R wrong. The norms are going to be low because the progression, the developmental progression, does not account for that. That is an atypical performance. Okay. Another very frequent question we've gotten is, why do I sometimes get a GFTA-3 sounds and sentences score higher than sounds and words score? Because really, when you think about it, isn't sounds and sentences a much harder task? It's connected speech. You would think that the score would be wrong. Or not wrong, but the score would be lower than a simple task such as sounds and words. You know, you are absolutely right. Connected speech is a more difficult task, and that kind of explains why you would see that score discrepancy. It's because of two different things. One is that in sounds and words, as we've said, all phonemes are scored. So every opportunity that that child is going to miss a target sound is accounted for. In comparison, in sounds and sentences, it's a longer, more difficult task. It's hard to score every single consonant production. So we looked at our data and we only counted or targeted the sounds in the words that show the most difference in performance between children who are typically developing and children who are atypically developing in their speech development. So what we're saying is this. And if you had a child who was 5, they tested in sounds and words, and they misarticulated B in final position and D in medial position and the G in medial position as well, they have 3 errors accounted against them. But you know what? If they also took the sounds and sentences subtest, they get 0 errors counted against them for those errors that they made, because there wasn't any difference in our normative sample between them, and so they weren't counted. Okay, next slide is that it goes back to, if it's a more difficult task, why don't they get a lower score when they don't do as well? Well, think about it this way. Those norm scores are compared to typically developing peers. So when it's a more difficult task, a typically developing person is more likely to get it wrong. So if they're more likely to get it wrong, that error isn't going to be as significant if a child who is atypically gets it wrong as well, versus when it sounds in words, an easier task, a child who's developing their sounds normally is more likely to get it right, and so it's going to be more of a glaring, hey, I'm getting it wrong, there's an error here. Think about it in terms of, well, I like to think about it in terms of a math analogy. So if we had a child who was, let's say, 8, because they're starting to do multiplication then. Or no, let's say the child is 5. So a child who's 5, they're expected to be able to count 1 through 10. It's pretty easy. They're going to get it right. But if you had a child who couldn't count and stumbled and just said 1, 4, 9, and 10, it's going to be a glaring error. Whereas a child who's 5 and asks, what's 2 times 2? And they can't come up with 4. Well, that's not going to be a glaring error. And the reason is because most 5-year-olds haven't started multiplication yet. Next slide, please. We're going to talk about emergence and mastery. You said we were going to talk about this, and here we go. So One of the premises of GFTA-3 is that there is a difference between emergence and mastery, and we really need to look at that in our test results. What we mean by emergence is the age at which a phoneme is present, one or more correct productions in the child's repertoire. We show this information in Appendix D, and what we say about it is that the data is showing 50%, 75%, and 90% of the children were able to spontaneously produce a phoneme correctly one or more times on GFTA-3 based on age and sex. So what we're saying is you're going to see 3 columns for girls, and you'll see 3 columns for boys. And what you see is that based on age, that 90% of the sample were able to produce R at what age, versus that's just one production. They only had to do it right one time. The difference is when we go to mastery. Mastery is defined at ages in which 90% of the GFTA-3 Northern sample, again by sex, produce the phoneme with at least 85% accuracy. So instead of just saying they have to do it right one time, they have to do it right. They have to say it right enough times to have it measured as 85% accuracy. So if it was tested in 3 occurrences, they would have to get all 3 occurrences right in order to hit mastery. Okay, and the reason we want to make that distinction between emergence and mastery is, again, in research, we see that it's a process. It's not common for children to go from not producing a phoneme to spontaneously all of a sudden waking up one day and saying, I can say that and get it with 85%, as this table will show. You're going to start out somewhere kind of testing the waters, practice, practice, practice until you get it right. So the beginning of the bar to the left, let's pick out where the arrow is of R and S. What we can see is at 3, kids are going to start producing it right. Once or twice, they're kind of practicing along from going to 3 years old, 4 years old, 5, 6, 7, until they hit 8, or 7, 11 in this case, 8, 1, 7, 11, that they are going to get it right most of the time, and most of the time is 85% in this case. Okay, we see that in different ways. Again, in the first table, the table on top, that's from GFTA-2. What we can see is that we'll look at the values. The values are presented as 0.32, 0.44, and what that's saying is the percentage of children in that sample that we're able. So if we look at R for males, that first table, we can see that initial position, our initial position, roughly 32% of the children in that sample produce the correct R. But it isn't until, if you look, that at age 6 to age 7, that 90% of those boys in that sample were able to produce it correctly all the time. And all the time in GFTA-2 meant one time. Okay? That is very consistent with what is shown in Table D1 in GFTA-3, which is that if you look across all the different types of R productions, if we look at that last column to the right, produced by 90% of children, at 2, 6 to 2, 11, they were starting to produce some R's. At least one or more times, and again, this is emergent. Okay, on our next slide, though, we're going to talk about mastery. So what we had kind of talked about using GFTA-2, you're going to look at the percentage of males who were able to produce that R one time, and when we talk about it at 85%, it's not until 6 that they're going to show that. That's for mastery. If we look at it, but it's only one time, and that is that. Here, for GFTA-2. Now for GFTA-3, that's different, and it gets a little, what I would say is, I'm having word finding difficulties. Stringent, I think, is the word I'm looking for. Is that, remember, in GFTA-3, it's not one time. Those sounds are not produced one time or not tested one time. So that means for mastery at 85%, they have to produce it many times correctly, not just that one time that we see in comparison. And so on RD2 chart that you'll see, or table rather, when does R get mastered? And what we'll see is for 85% mastery by 90% of our sample, that means 90%, in this case, 90% of the males in the sample mastered at 85%, could say 85% of them correctly. Or, some came in at 6 to 611. Some of those were easier, like that middle R. Or as we say, 7 to 711, as low, or even older at 811 because of that medial BR. Okay, so again, what this is a summary of is that there is a difference between emergence and mastery. Emergence is when they can say it one time. Mastery is when they're at it accountable for an 85% accuracy. With that said, I see our time is going by, so I'm going to go ahead and move forward to interpretation. So interpretation, again, we talk about, so what's typical and what's not typical. So we have an example of Omar. So at age 2-4, he couldn't say any of his R's right. He made 22 errors. That's what you see for raw score, because he couldn't say any of those R's right. But look what that converts to. That converts to a standard score of 120 and a percentile rank of 91. Why? Because he's 2-4. When he's 2-4, he's just like any other little kid. They are not saying R's. But what happens is that when he's 4-4 and he's still not saying any of those R's right, that standard score, or that raw score of 22 errors, translates to a standard score of 94 and a percentile rank of 34. 94, he's not doing great, but he's not doing horribly either. 94 is pretty close to average at this point. And again, why is that? And it's because he's 4-4. So children are starting to practice that R, and it's becoming more and more accurate. So he's not too far off the mark. But what happens when Omar becomes older and he's now 6-4 and he's still not saying any R's? That raw score error of 22 translates to a standard score of 75. And why is that? It's because in normal development, boys as well as girls by the age of 6-4 have practiced that R enough and are getting to the point of mastery. We're not saying totally at mastery, but getting to the point of mastery. And poor Omar here, he hasn't said R at all. So not only isn't he getting to the point of mastery, he hasn't even started emergence. Okay, we have an example for Jenny. It's the same pattern. When Jenny is young and she misses all those R's, it's typical development. We're not too worried. But when Jenny gets to 6-4 and isn't producing R at all, look what happens. She gets a standard score of 64 and a percentile rank of 1. And again, it's because it's atypical development. Okay. So what does that mean when we start to plan intervention? Well, we love GFTA and we think it's the end-all be-all, but that's not really true. GFTA-3 scores provide one point of reference. It's a norm reference data point. That's part of the information that you should use to diagnose a disorder, but there's many other factors, and so some of the factors we consider when we're looking at assessment results and evaluating what we should do is we look at the developmental patterns and progression. We look at correct and incorrect productions of an error sound in specific context. Is that sound stimulable? How's the intelligibility of that child overall? We look at, are there negative academic impact or not? we examine the oral motor and praxia issues that might be involved, as well as when we say other, such as teacher concerns as well as parent concerns. So let's look at Omar again at age 4-4. So he gets that SAM score of 94. Confidence interval is between 61 and 70 at 90% confidence. Okay. When we look at the mapping, we have the light green arrow lines signifying where he is between 4 and 4-5, and all the sounds above that are the sounds that at this point should be emerging, versus all the sounds below that arrow line are the sounds that, kids typically, they haven't emerged. So that's that comparison that you're going to see. He's looking okay. Okay. We're going to look at the next slide and look at mastery. Now, again, that light blue arrow is signifying his age range. And when we circle the errors he made, look at all those errors. They're all below his age. So is it that we're not concerned? It's that we're not overly concerned, because he seems like he's doing what other children, what other boys his age at 4-4 are expected to do. So, but we don't just use the Goldman-Fristoe. We have to consider other other factors. So, what are the other factors? Well, the parent and teacher concerns are that his speech is a little babyish compared to his sister Rosie's speech when she was 4, and the parents really want him to be able to say his name. He has Omar. He wants to say that R, and they also want him to say his sister's name with that initial R as well. But you know what? He's already stimulable. His intelligibility, based on his preschool teacher's report, is that she can understand everything he's saying. His intelligibility is good. It's like that of the other preschoolers she has in her classroom. The impact is that, Omar isn't aware that he has these errors, and that, he's doing well in preschool. He's engaging in the activities, and everything's good. However, where there's some concern is that he's starting to avoid talking at home, because he doesn't want to be corrected all the time for not saying Omar and Rosie. So what are we going to do about this planning? And the planning is that maybe what we should do is do some parent consultation on how to approach it. We want to go ahead and engage Omar to go ahead and try out the initial R and the final R and keep practicing, but not to the point where he is avoidant. Okay, Jenny, she's 6'4". She got a standard score of 64 because she can't produce any of those R's correctly yet. And what we see is that pink line is how old Jenny is, and look what happens. All those R's should have emerged, but they haven't. So that's pretty atypical. And then when we look at the next slide for mastery, again, that pink bar is the guideline, and look at all the sounds. Most of those sounds are above that line, meaning that she should have mastered them, or should be on the verge of mastering them. Okay. So we have a question by Elaine, and her question is that, is there a recommendation then that a student begin speech therapy for R at 6, or rather 4 or 6, should they be involved in services at that point? And again, what we're really saying about this, those are great questions, is that GFTA-3 is 1 point and 1 factor measure. Of course, if you have a child, when I was in clinical practice, I had a child who was 4 and had difficulties with R, and grandma was convinced that he needed physical therapy, or he needed speech therapy, and it had to do with, it was impacting him to the point, this little boy, to the point that he wasn't going to speak at all. There were too many R's in their names, and so he was getting correction all the time. So in that case, we did accept him into speech therapy because there was a really big negative impact. But if you see that there's not that much impact for a child who's 4 and isn't producing R, then maybe you would want to consider waiting. But in the case of a child who's 6 and no R's have emergence whether they're a boy or a girl, that is very atypical. It's not just the GFTA-3 data that have been collected. It is the research from previous publications that show emergence of R in boys as well as girls starts